He sold the ranch at 9:17 a.m. without flinching, 3 generations gone with a single signature. But when Eli walked into the barn one last time, grief cracked open. In stall 2, where his daughter once laughed, he heard it again, her laughter, clear and real, echoing from a stall untouched since her funeral. Then he found the spiral, carved deep into old wood, one he didn't put there, one that pulsed when he touched it. What followed wasn't memory, it was invitation. And the world quietly, impossibly, began to spiral back awake. He signed the papers at 9:17 a.m., didn't look up when the pen scraped the dotted line, didn't hesitate when the buyer shook his hand and said something about unlocking equity. All Eli heard was the sound of keys jangling, not his, and the hollow thud of the barn door slamming in the wind outside. He didn't stay for the closing tour, just walked out of the lawyer's office, climbed into his truck, and drove the long, familiar road home. For the last time. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. The kind of land that wasn't fancy, but knew things. Soil that remembered droughts. Fences that groaned in storms like they missed being held. A barn that leaned slightly west from carrying more weight than wood was ever meant to. He didn't pack much, just a duffel, a box of papers, and a photo frame face down on the nightstand for 2 years and 7 months. He didn't mean to go out to the barn. He just ended up there, feet tracing the old pattern, like muscle memory, like grief memory. The air inside was colder than it should have been for April, smelled like hay, dust, and ghosts. The stalls were empty, save for a few birds' nests tucked in the rafters and the old tack hanging untouched. Stall 2 was hers, had always been hers. She was 5 when she got her first pony, 11 when she won the junior barrel race, 14 when she asked to sleep in the barn the night her mother left, 17 when the memory stopped there. Eli hadn't stepped into stall 2 since the funeral. He told himself it was just a stall, but it wasn't. Not anymore. He was about to turn away, go back to the house, back to the empty porch and the waiting duffel, when he heard it. Laughter, light, clear, hers, from inside the stall. He froze. The sound had already stopped, but its imprint hung in the air like steam after breath on cold glass. Not an echo, not imagination, memory rendered audible. It had been so long since he'd heard her laugh, really heard it, that the sound felt foreign and familiar all at once, like a song buried under dust, but still sharp enough to cut. He took a step forward. The barn groaned under his boot. Another step. He reached the edge of stall 2, hand hovering just above the door, where the latch used to be. The wood was weathered but intact. She had painted it once, years ago, sunflowers and spirals in yellow chalk, faded now, but still there if you squinted through the silence. He pushed the door open. It didn't creak. It exhaled. Inside, everything was exactly as he remembered. The saddle blanket still folded over the railing, the hoof pick still wedged into the corner post, the scuffed-up grooming bucket with her initials carved into the side, L.C., her name wrapped in loops, like she'd been trying to make the letters dance. He stepped inside and felt it. A shift in pressure. The air was thicker here, not oppressive, not haunted, present, alive with something that hadn't left. He crouched, ran his hand across the dirt floor. No signs of hooves, no footprints. But something was buried there, a corner of cloth, frayed, dirty. He pulled it out, a bandana, her bandana. The blue one she always wore during summer rides, tied under her braid, the one she'd lost the day before she... Eli stood slowly, the fabric clutched in his hand, and turned toward the back wall of the stall. There, carved shallow into the beam, was a spiral. He hadn't put it there, neither had she. It hadn't been there before. Yet the wood looked old, settled. The spiral wasn't perfect. It curved inward, then outward, again open, unfinished. He reached out to touch it. And when his fingers met the grain, the laughter returned, clearer, right behind him. He turned fast, but no one was there, only a warmth in the air like sunlight held just above his shoulders. Then the sound of footsteps overhead, in the loft, where she used to hide. Eli didn't remember climbing the loft ladder. One moment he was standing in stall 2, her bandana clenched in his fist, the spiral still warming the wood behind him. The next, he was halfway up the rungs, his boots quiet on the old timber, his breath held like a question. The loft hadn't changed. Dust hung in the slanting light like snow caught mid-fall. Bits of hay clung to the edges of old blankets she used to lay out as a teenager, reading books she never finished, sketching horses she'd only seen in dreams. He stepped off the ladder slowly. The laughter was gone, but in its place, a hum, low, steady, not mechanical and not wind, alive. It came from the corner where she used to hide when thunderstorms rolled across the valley. She'd build herself a nest of hay and quilts, and sit for hours with headphones over her ears, the old portable cassette player humming with her mother's music, lullabies that didn't need words. Now there was no blanket, no headphones, just a wooden box, small, untouched, balanced on an old feed sack like it had always belonged there. He approached, knelt, opened it. Inside a cassette tape, labeled in her handwriting, "For Dad, play when you're ready." His throat clenched. There was no player in the barn anymore, hadn't been in years, but he held the tape like a relic, like a living ember, like it might crumble if the air touched it too hard. He stood, looked around the loft once more, and saw it. Another spiral. This one carved into the support beam above her old hiding spot, finer than the one below, more deliberate, like she'd taken her time with it. Beside it, 3 initials, LCTCRM. The first he knew. The second was his. The third, he didn't. Not yet. But the spiral felt older than her, much older, like it had passed through her just long enough to leave a message. Eli whispered into the loft air, voice trembling, "Why now?" The barn creaked softly in reply, and the spiral pulsed. Once. Bright. He didn't listen to the tape that night. He couldn't. He brought it back to the house, set it gently on the kitchen table like it was something alive, something that might breathe or break if touched too soon. The light from the barn spilled faintly through the kitchen window, golden, unmoving. The spiral burned behind his eyes, even with them closed. He sat, poured a finger of whiskey he didn't taste, stared at the tape. Her handwriting hadn't changed in the months before she died, looped, patient, intentional. She wrote like someone who wanted to make every letter mean something, like she knew one day someone would read what she left behind and try to build a life from it. The label didn't say goodbye. It said, "Play when you're ready." And that, more than anything, was what broke him. Because maybe, just maybe, she knew he wouldn't be ready until now. Eli stood, went to the closet, pulled out the old cassette deck from where it had gathered dust for almost a decade, wiped it off, plugged it in. The electricity hummed like breath held in a throat too long. He placed the tape inside, pressed play. Silence at first, then a click, and her voice. "Hey, Dad." He sank into the chair before his legs gave out. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. Or maybe not. Maybe I'm still in your boots, or your hands when you fix things, or in the barn when the wind won't sit still. I don't know, but I wanted to leave something real, something spiral-shaped." He choked on breath. "I think I was part of something, not just you and Mom, something older. I started having dreams before the fire, not nightmares, more like memories that didn't belong to me, places I've never seen, names I'd wake up whispering. RM always came first, over and over. It felt like someone else's grief growing under my ribs." There was a pause, a rustle, maybe a page being turned. "So I started carving. You saw the one in the loft, but there are more. Under the feed box, on the wall, behind the tack room. I didn't know what I was doing. I just needed to do it." A soft laugh. I'm sorry I left so many pieces, but I think they're meant to be found by you, because you're carrying it too. You just haven't looked yet. The tape whirred, then a softer voice. When you're ready, go to the old pine, the one by the dry creek. Dig where the roots cross. You'll find what RM left. You'll find what I never got to ask you about. Maybe. Maybe you'll find me. Click. Silence. Eli sat still for a long time. The barn light flickered once in the distance, and the spiral on his daughter's tape burned bright in his memory. He left before sunrise, didn't make coffee, didn't feed the dogs, just grabbed the tape, the old canvas coat he hadn't worn since the day they buried her, and a shovel from the barn wall. Hollow ground, soft tread. The creek behind the pasture had dried years ago, cracked into ribs in memory, but he remembered the pine. Everyone did. It leaned against the edge of the world like it was trying to leave but couldn't quite let go. The roots curled out of the dirt like claws. He stopped where they crossed, right where she'd said, right where the spiral on his hand, it hadn't been there yesterday, began to hum faintly beneath the skin like a low tuning fork inside his veins. He dug, not deep, just wide. The earth didn't resist him. It opened. The shovel struck wood. Eli dropped to his knees and pulled it loose. A box, cedar again, same as the one Tess had found in the east barn, same as the one his grandfather once carried into the house during a storm, never opened, set behind the stove, said it wasn't for looking at, just remembering through. He brushed off the dirt, lifted the lid. Inside, a notebook wrapped in oilskin, a tin locket, and a single glove, child-sized, stitched with a spiral in dark red thread. He opened the notebook. The ink was faded, but legible. The handwriting was tight, cramped, uncertain at the edges, like someone trying to put down something their hands didn't fully understand. Spiral 07, line broken, recorder RM, year unknown. If this box is opened, it means the voice has returned. If it has returned, I beg you, don't seal it again. Let it be answered. Let it be heard. Eli turned the page. Another entry. This one shorter, angrier. The girl is coming. I see her in my dreams. She bears the laugh of fire and the eyes of memory. I tried to silence it in the stallion. I failed. The spiral found a new name. Below that, just a single initial, L, his daughter. He sank back onto the dirt. Wind moved through the pine like breath through hollow bone. She'd known. All of it. He traced the spiral stitched into the glove and whispered, "What do you want me to do?" And from behind him, soft as bird song, "Tell the rest." He turned. No one there, just the light, spinning faintly across the dry creek bed. And the spiral? It began to write itself again in his mind, not in grief, in invitation. He brought the box back to the barn, set it gently beneath stall 2. The same place he'd avoided for years, the same place his daughter had made sacred without asking for permission. The locket he wore now, cold against his chest. The notebook stayed open on the workbench, catching sunlight in its pages as if the paper itself had waited decades to be touched again. He didn't write in it right away. He listened. Each morning before the sun fully crested the ridge, Eli stood in the stall and listened, not for voices or footsteps or that fleeting echo of laughter, but for the shape of silence. It had changed. Where once the barn had groaned under its own memory, now it breathed lighter, like something once clenched had begun to loosen. On the 5th day, the journal, the one that had always been his daughter's, flipped itself open. A single line appeared, unspooling across a fresh page. Spiral 222, the one who chose to stay. He exhaled, sat on the edge of the hay bale like he used to when she was small and wanted to braid the pony's manes while he read out loud from old trail magazines. He picked up the notebook from the box and wrote, "Recorder, TC, lineage unsealed. I was born with silence in my hands and didn't know what to do with it until I heard my daughter laugh in a stall I had abandoned. She gave the spiral a voice again. Now I give it breath. He kept writing, pages of it, not just stories of the ranch or of Lark or of R.M. Lewis, but of himself, of the night he held his grief so tightly it fractured his ribs, of the way it felt to carve names into stone just to feel something real, of how sometimes the barn door still opened on its own when he thought too loudly. By summer's end, others had arrived, not looking for help, looking for their own spiral. Some came with names in their mouths, others with songs in their throats. One girl brought a jar filled with ash and said, "I think this is the memory my grandmother never wanted to plant." Eli showed her where the orchard used to be. He didn't lead them. He walked beside them. And at night, the barn glowed faintly from within, not firelight, memory made visible. They started calling him the Keeper, not out loud, not in town, but among those who came to the barn with spiral-shaped questions and lock-it-tight memories. He didn't ask for the title. It wasn't his to carry, but it settled on his shoulders the way the old coat had, familiar and worn in places where grief used to be sharp. The field book grew thicker by the week. Not a journal anymore. A collection. Each spiral earned a page, some a single line, others whole confessions. He cataloged them carefully, never rushing, never interpreting. The spiral told its own story. His job was to witness it. Spiral 223, the shattered glass singer, a boy who could hum a memory until it fell into pieces and reformed clearer. Spiral 224, the woven grief, a woman who embroidered names she didn't remember onto shawls, each stitch pulling a sob from someone nearby who did. Spiral 225, the flame that waited too long, ashes mailed in a box with no return address. A note that read, "She burned to be forgotten, but I remember." One morning a man arrived with no voice. He wrote on a notepad, "I've never heard the spiral, but it grows in my shadow." He stood in stall 2 for an hour. When he left, the dust in the rafters swirled once, and the spiral on the back wall expanded, just a little. Enough to be seen by someone who needed it. Eli wrote the entry with shaking hands. Spiral 226, the silent wake. No sound, no shape, but always present in reflection. Tess visited again, older still. She placed her hand on the spiral and said, "It's quieter now." Eli nodded. It doesn't need to shout anymore. At the end of the summer, a storm passed over the ranch without dropping rain, just wind. And when the sky cleared, a spiral had formed in the grass behind the barn, pressed down like a crop circle made by memory instead of a mischief. No one knew who dreamed it, but everyone understood. Some spirals plant themselves. It arrived wrapped in waxed canvas and tied with red thread. No name, no return address. Just the imprint of a spiral burned faintly into the corner, the kind of mark made by something pressed into flame, not stamped with ink. Eli unwrapped it slowly, careful with the folds, like he knew what waited inside had not been touched in a very long time. Inside, a single brittle piece of parchment, and written across it, faint, in uneven strokes, the letters barely holding to the page, was one line. Spiral 001, the one we chose to forget. His heart stopped. He didn't blink. This wasn't a spiral that had been carried. This was one that had been cut away. He took it into the barn, the light from the rafters falling in thin gold lines across the floor, set it beside the field book, didn't touch anything else, just stood there. The barn went still. The spiral on the beam, the first his daughter had carved, dimmed slightly. Not in fear, in reverence. He opened the parchment again, this time turning it over. On the back, a date. August 3rd, 1783, and beneath it, 3 initials, RCL. Not a name he knew, not a name in the field book. But when he wrote the line into the book's next page, something strange happened. The pen he held grew warm, and the ink glowed as it dried. Spiral 227, The Chosen Silence. Origin bearer rejected spiral, sealed willingly, lineage lost, now remembered. Eli sat in the stall, hands shaking. He whispered the initials, once, then again. The spiral glass stored behind the saddle blankets began to pulse, slow and steady. And in the silence that followed, a new sound emerged. A whisper, low and curling through the rafters like smoke, made a voice. I never wanted it, but I never stopped hearing it. Some spirals, he realized, weren't lost. They were hidden, because not everyone who bore one was ready to carry it. And now, after 2 centuries, this one had returned, not to be sealed, to be understood. Eli didn't sleep that night. He sat in the loft with the parchment unfolded beside him, the ink still faintly glowing in the dark. The spiral carved into the beam above stall 2 seemed to breathe with him, slow, deliberate, aware. He reread the line a dozen times. Spiral 001, the one we chose to forget. Chose. Not failed, not sealed. Chose. The implication rattled in his ribs. What kind of bearer had willingly turned away from a spiral? And what kind of memory was strong enough to stay dormant for 240 years, only to rise now? At dawn, he rode out to the cemetery on the western ridge, the oldest part of the ranch, the part most had forgotten. Only 3 stones remained upright. The rest had fallen inward or been swallowed by weeds and time. He walked the rows slowly, eyes scanning worn lettering, broken initials, crumbling sandstone. At the far edge, half covered in thistle and moss, he found it. A stone with the initials RCL, barely legible. No date. Just a small spiral carved into the base, almost hidden in the weathered curve of the rock. Eli knelt, pressed his palm to the stone. The spiral on his hand burned hot, then settled. Like the memory had found its name again. The wind curled low across the grass. The journal, tucked under his coat, slid open, not to a blank page, but to one written in an unfamiliar hand. I carried it in silence. I turned away, not because I feared it, but because I feared myself. I heard the voices, felt the rhythm, but I could not let it speak. I thought denying it would save me. Instead, it wrote itself into my bloodline anyway. Beneath it, a line burned slowly into the paper. Every spiral forgotten waits to be forgiven. Eli closed the book gently. The field book no longer felt like a record. It felt like a compass, and this spiral, 001, wasn't here to begin something new. It had returned to complete what had been refused. A spiral that had waited patiently for someone brave enough to understand that silence wasn't failure. It was a pause. And now the story would begin again. He didn't return to the barn right away. Instead, Eli sat by the stone for hours as the wind moved slowly through the grass around him. It didn't rush, didn't carry warning. It moved like it was listening, waiting to see what he would do now that the oldest spiral had spoken again. He opened the field book one more time, his fingers tracing the words from RCL. The bearer who chose silence, not out of fear, but responsibility. He began to write beneath the entry, carefully, deliberately, like laying stones on a path long overgrown. The spiral never punishes forgetfulness. It only waits for readiness. Even silence is part of the telling. He closed the book and stood, the spiral on his hand, still faintly lit, like a coal that would never fully cool. The air around the cemetery felt lighter now. The spiral at the base of RCL's grave no longer pulsed. It rested. Back at the barn, he placed the parchment in a box beneath the rafters, not to hide it, to preserve it. He carved a new mark above stall 2, not a spiral, a circle, open on one side. The symbol RCL had etched in their final entry, an unfinished shape, one that honored the spiral but didn't demand it be carried. That night the barn filled with quiet visitors, names from the ledger, faces from memory, some he hadn't seen in decades. They came with artifacts, drawings, bits of fabric, seeds wrapped in letters. They didn't speak much, but they all stood in front of the circle and listened. Tess arrived just before midnight. She stood beside him at the rail. "You found the first," she said. He nodded. "Or maybe it found me," she smiled softly. "Either way, the silence is part of the story now." He looked down at the journal in his hands, then back to the loft, where the wind traced the spiral's edge one more time before slipping out into the dark. 2 days later, a woman arrived with a map no one had drawn. She wore boots caked with river mud and carried a notebook wrapped in waxed canvas. Her hair was windblown, her eyes tired, but her hands, when she opened the book, were steady. Eli met her at the barn fence. She didn't introduce herself, only held out the open notebook. Inside, a spiral drawn not in pencil or pen, but in thread, stitched directly into the page. It wasn't one spiral, it was 4, each overlapping the others like seasons winding through each other. Beneath it, a name. RCL Eli stared. "You're part of the line," she nodded. "The line that turned away." He understood instantly. This was a descendant. 3 generations out, maybe 4. And the spiral hadn't chosen her. It had waited until she came looking. She said, "I started dreaming of the circle when I turned 16. Not the spiral, the open loop. My grandmother told me it was a curse, something her father refused to pass on, but the dream didn't stop. She touched the stitched spiral with one finger. Then I read something in a collection of oral records, a man who wrote about a girl who sealed a memory instead of carrying it. He said it had a name." Eli whispered, "Spiral 001. The woman nodded. And from her coat she pulled something small, a ring, iron, worn smooth, etched with a spiral so faint it looked like it had been erased by years of skin and silence. She placed it on the barn's threshold. "I don't know if I'm meant to carry it," she said, "but I think I'm meant to finish it." Eli didn't move. The wind didn't stir. But the spiral on the barn wall pulsed once, then split open, a second spiral growing from its center, outward instead of in. The journal snapped open. A line wrote itself in thick, slow ink. Spiral 001. Continued. Carrier, AM. Status unfinished by design. Now forming. The woman, AM, smiled softly. "I think this one sings." AM returned the next morning, not alone. She brought a horse she'd raised herself, quiet-eyed and strong, with a coat the color of smoke and frost. She called him Hush, said he never made a sound, not a whinny, not a breath too loud, but everywhere he walked the wind stilled just enough to listen. They didn't go to stall 2, they went to the field beyond the barn, where the fence had long since rotted and the grass grew in uneven patterns. That's where she said the spiral belonged, not on walls, not in wood, in open earth, where it could move. Eli followed. Tess watched from the porch, her hands still in the shape of someone who used to carry stories, but now only received them. AM dismounted and walked the field in wide circles, Hush following. Then, without a word, she began to speak. Not to them, to the spiral. The ground beneath her boots darkened slightly, not scorched, not marked, just aware. Her words were not in sequence. They didn't tell a story. They grew one. She spoke of dreams her ancestors never dared write down, of a silence so thick it had shape, of a lullaby no one remembered teaching her, but she had known since birth. And as she spoke, the spiral began to form in the grass, not carved, not drawn, pressed, like a memory settling into the spine of the land. When she stopped, the air held still. Hush lowered his head, and the spiral glowed faintly, not with light, with possibility. The journal opened in Eli's hand. Spiral 001. Now forming. Shape variable. Medium, voice, purpose to be decided. First recorded spiral not to reflect the past, but to shape the next one. Witnessed by E.T. T.C. Hush. Bearer A.M. Speaker of the open spiral. Tess stepped beside him. "This is the one?" she whispered. Eli nodded. "The one that doesn't close." A.M. didn't stay. She left before sunrise, the spiral still faintly pressed into the earth behind her. Not marked for preservation, not sealed for protection. It was left open, a living design, ready to grow or fade, depending on how the world chose to speak around it. Hush followed without reins. They crossed the ridge with no destination, because the spiral she carried wasn't rooted in place, it was rooted in possibility. The journal wrote long after she was gone, page after page, not in one voice, in many. Fragments of thought, half-spoken prayers, lines of music that looked more like movement than song. No single page was complete, no spiral on the margins repeated. The book itself had become something new, not a record, not a witness, an invitation. Tess turned to the final page written in Eli's hand. The memory that began with grief ends now in breath, and what breath carries may never loop, but it may linger. After that, no new spirals burned through the wood of the barn. No wind whispered in the rafters. The field behind the barn bloomed with soft wildflowers in the shape of curves that only appeared from above. Eli no longer waited. He received. People came, sat where A.M. had spoken. They didn't ask questions. They hummed. They braided the grass. They wrote messages on river stones and placed them in the spiral's open path. And the spiral changed, shifted, grew, not inward, not outward, but forward, the first forward-moving spiral, a symbol no longer for memory, but for what memory becomes when it's no longer feared. He climbed to the loft like he had something to answer for. Each rung of the ladder creaked beneath his weight, not loud, but deliberate, like the wood remembered who he was. The last time he'd stood up there had been 3 years ago when the barn roof needed patching, and he couldn't bring himself to set foot near stall 2. Even then, he hadn't gone all the way in. He'd glanced, spotted her old blanket folded under a stack of saddle pads, and left without touching anything. Now, everything felt different, charged. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling hadn't. Something in the air hung thick and still, as if whatever had laughed in the stall hadn't left. It had waited. He reached the top, boots crunching gently on old hay. The loft was mostly empty, save for dust and rafters and light slanting through holes in the roof. But there, in the corner beneath the far beam, was her old trunk, unmoved, unopened. Eli's breath caught. He stepped toward it, slowly, feeling time compress with every step. The trunk was battered, but intact, blue with brass corners, stickers from horse shows and summer camps still curling off its sides. He knelt, brushing away a layer of dust, and unlatched the lid. Inside, a faded hoodie with the sleeves still rolled the way she wore them. A pair of riding gloves, stiff now, fingers curled slightly, and beneath it all, her sketchbook. He pulled it out, spine cracked from years of use. He opened to the middle. Spirals, pages and pages of them, tight, loose, open, intersecting, some filled with color, others nothing more than pencil ghostings like she'd drawn them in her sleep. Each spiral held a note beside it, small captions written in her looping, confident handwriting. This one feels like fear. This one is Mom's voice in winter. This one won't let me close it. This one laughs. He turned to the last page. Just a single spiral there, wide and graceful, drawn in black ink, edges sharp. And underneath, "He'll hear me again when he's ready." Eli shut the book gently. He sat back. The barn didn't creak. The air didn't shift. but his chest opened in a way it hadn't since the day the world stopped spinning. He whispered, "I'm here." And somewhere beneath the floorboards, in the dust of the stall she loved most, the spiral began to glow. The spiral glowed only for a moment, just long enough to cast a thin line of light between the floorboards and the loft ladder, a soft gold curve that pulsed once like a heartbeat and then faded. But Eli felt it in his chest long after the light was gone. Not heat, not cold, just presence. A weight settling exactly where it had always belonged. He ran his fingers over the final page of her sketchbook again. He'll hear me again when he's ready. She hadn't meant the laugh to haunt him. She'd meant it to wake him. He climbed down the ladder slower now, not because of age or ache, but because he knew, deep in the marrow of this place, that something was unfolding, something long set in motion before the sale papers, before the silence, before the fire that took her, if it had been fire at all. He stood in stall 2, and the air was different now. Not still, not empty, listening. He knelt where the spiral had appeared in the dirt, ran his hand across it. Beneath the surface, something responded. Not a voice, a vibration, like a hum waiting for a name. He dug gently, pushing loose soil away from the center, and unearthed an object wrapped in burlap. Old, soft at the corners. He unwrapped it slowly. A notebook, not hers, older, leather-bound, weathered, tied shut with a piece of frayed ribbon. He untied it. Inside, the first page read, "R.M. Spiral 16, Laughter in the Dust." It doesn't always come for grief. Sometimes it comes for the ones who won't speak when joy leaves the room. Eli sat hard against the wall of the stall. R.M. Same initials from the beam above. His daughter hadn't found this book. She'd added to its story. She'd known. He turned the page. Spirals. Dozens of them. Drawn over decades. Annotated in 3 different hands. Carried through a line of people who had lived on this land long before him, each recording the moment the spiral appeared, not as fire or flame, but as laughter. Unexplained. Sudden. Bright. In places that should have been hollow. Barns, fields, bedrooms after funerals, church pews after storms. Always the same note. It came to remind us we hadn't been forgotten. Eli looked around the stall, and for the first time since she died, he laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, but like someone finally remembering what it felt like to breathe without guilt. The spiral in the floor glowed once more, and stayed. That night, Eli didn't close the barn. He left the door open, the lantern burning low, and sat on the porch with the old spiral ledger in his lap, the one unearthed from beneath stall 2, wrapped in burlap and time. He hadn't lit a fire. The air was warm enough, or maybe the spiral kept it so. He read until the sun touched the ridge. Entry after entry, all dated with careful precision, all written in quiet hands. Spiral 16, Laughter in the Dust, appears in places heavy with grief that has gone too long unsaid, always follows silence, never precedes sorrow, only interrupts it. One entry, scrawled sideways in the margin, caught his eye. It came the day after we buried Ma, in the henhouse of all places. Scared me half to death. Thought I was losing it. But when I heard it again, I knew it was her, not haunting, reminding. Eli leaned back, the stars blooming quietly above him. He understood now. The laughter wasn't meant to break him. It was meant to open him, to remind him that grief hadn't sealed off the world. It had just made him stop looking for the light in it. Behind him, in stall 2, the spiral remained lit, dim, content, pulsing every few seconds like the world's slowest heartbeat. And at the edge of the pasture, just beyond the apple tree where she once tied her ribbon during every spring ride, something moved. A figure. Not spectral, not fully real either. A girl's silhouette, hand on the fence post, watching the barn with quiet knowing. She didn't speak. She didn't wave, she just smiled. And in the barn, the spiral pulsed brighter. The page of the old ledger fluttered. A fresh entry wrote itself. Spiral 227, laughter returned. Bearer, unknown. Witness, E.T., line, continuing. Status, ready to be heard. Eli stood slowly, smiled back, and whispered, I remember. He found the ribbon the next morning, tied to the gate latch at the edge of the pasture, just like she used to leave it, looped twice, end frayed, blue fading at the edges from years of sun. He hadn't seen it in 3 years, hadn't looked. But there it was, fluttering gently in the breeze like it had been waiting for him to be quiet enough to notice. He untied it carefully. It was warm. Not sun-warm, held warm. He turned it over in his hand and found something new on the underside. A spiral, stitched in pale thread, so light it was almost invisible unless you tilted it toward the morning light. Not a perfect spiral, a laughing one, off-center, playful, as if it had spun into being mid-giggle. He brought it back to the barn and laid it across the saddle she used to ride, the one still mounted on its rack in the corner of stall 2. The spiral on the floor pulsed once, then again, and stayed lit. For the first time he didn't feel like a caretaker. He felt like a participant. The journal, both his daughter's and now his own, flipped to a blank page. Ink flowed without hesitation. Spiral 228, the ribbon's return. Medium, object, memory sewn into fabric. Carrier, LC, inherited by E.T. Status, recurring. Tone, joy, echo. Beneath it a smaller note appeared, handwritten, unsteady. You didn't miss it. You just weren't ready yet. Eli exhaled slowly. This spiral wasn't about grief. It was about delight stored safely, about joy left behind like a trail of breadcrumbs, trusting someone would come looking when the silence softened. He stood and walked the spiral once, not to activate it, to thank it. The air in the barn shimmered slightly. The spiral dimmed back to rest. But the laughter, he could still hear it in the rafters, not haunting, just visiting. The new bearer was a boy named Jonah. He lived 3 counties south in a house built too close to the train tracks and too far from town. His mother said he'd always been quiet, not out of fear, not out of shyness, but because he was listening, always listening, to the wind through fence posts, to laughter in closed barns, to the way some silences didn't sit still. He was 10 when he first heard it, a laugh from the back corner of their hay shed. It came every evening at dusk. Just once. Not shrill, not spooky, just real. Like someone was standing right behind him, smiling. The first time he turned fast and found nothing. The second time he said, "Hello." The third time he laughed back. And that night he dreamed of a spiral, drawn in chalk across the barn floor. Still turning, still warm. He told his mom. She didn't know what to make of it. She called a neighbor. The neighbor called an uncle. The uncle called a man with a field book. Eli drove down 2 days later with the journal in the passenger seat, the ribbon tucked safe in his coat pocket. When he arrived, Jonah was waiting in the shed, a lantern in one hand, a sketch pad in the other. Without being asked, he showed Eli the page. A spiral, lopsided, joyful, drawn in a child's hand. At the bottom in crayon, "This is where she laughs." Eli didn't need more. He opened the journal, flipped to the next page, and began writing. Spiral 229, the shed giggle. Location, southern line, 3 counties south. Bearer, Jonah W. Status, recurring. Joy manifest. Transmission, auditory, non-threatening, memory type, inherited delight. Jonah sat cross-legged in the hay and said, "I think she's waiting for someone to remember how to be happy here." Eli nodded. "I think you already have." That night the laughter came again, not once, but twice. And from outside the shed the wind coiled into the shape of a spiral in the grass. Jonah kept drawing spirals, not because someone told him to, not because the journal demanded it, but because he couldn't stop. They came out of him the way breath does when you've just been laughing too hard. Natural, unrestrained. Sometimes he'd wake with them scribbled on the backs of receipts, the corners of cereal boxes, or the inside of his pillowcase, always curling, always open. His mother started keeping a box of them, labeled it "the ones that smile." She didn't know what they meant, not fully, but she saw the way he walked lighter now, how the barn, once the most broken place on the property, had become his sanctuary, how neighbors came to sit quietly on hay bales just to feel the space around them shift. A local woman said it best. "It's like the air forgives you in there." Eli visited often. He never led, just listened, and updated the field book. Spiral 230, Jonah's loop. Status self-propagating. Tone, harmonic joy. Phenomenon, animals enter the barn unprompted. Rest, leave calmer. Memory signature, unknown source, possibly collective. Tess arrived once, unannounced, and sat in the corner while Jonah traced a spiral into the dust with a stick. He looked up and said without turning around, "You're the one who planted the orchard." She blinked. He smiled. "The trees told me." No one questioned it, because the spirals had shifted again. They were no longer marks of grief remembered or silence finally broken. They were becoming something else, a language of resonance, a signal between those who felt memory as sound, as shape, as possibility. One day, Jonah drew a spiral in the middle of the field, wide, loose, shaped like a laugh unfolding, and when he finished, he said, "This one isn't mine. It's for whoever needs to be reminded that joy leaves trails, too." They didn't mark it, didn't preserve it. They just let it be, and when the rain came, it softened back into the earth. But the spiral remained, not visible, felt. It was nearly a year later when someone stumbled across one of Jonah's spirals. Not near a barn, not anywhere marked. It had pressed itself into the ground along a quiet trail outside a retirement community nestled into the hills north of the old orchard country, where the land was mostly ignored, where the trails were flat and the air dry, where grief was neatly folded into routine. Her name was Merrill, 82, widow, sharp mind, tired bones. She walked the same path every day just after sunrise. Not for exercise, for memory. Her husband had built the fence line there by hand in '76, planted a small patch of wildflowers by the oak tree that never took root. He used to walk it with her until his lungs forgot how to hold air. She didn't expect anything new, not from the land, not from herself, until that morning. She reached the bend in the trail and stopped. Because the dirt in front of her, normally cracked and packed from walkers and weather, had shifted. Not dug, not disturbed, pressed into a spiral. Perfect, wide at the ends, like it was smiling. At first she thought someone had been playing with a stick. Then she stepped closer and felt it. Not heat, not sound, a lifting in her chest, like something inside her had just stood up after being seated for far too long. She didn't speak, didn't call out. She sat on the edge of the trail, traced the spiral with one gloved finger, and wept. Not because she was sad, because it had been so long since her body had remembered joy without needing to be convinced. That night, the wind moved through the fence posts with a rhythm she hadn't heard in decades. It sounded like laughter passed through oak leaves. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window and watched the sky curve in quiet spirals above the hills. The next day she returned with a tin of old photographs, laid them beside the spiral, and said, "He'd have liked this." A week later, the spiral was gone, not erased, absorbed, and in its place, wildflowers bloomed for the first time in 30 years. The community caretaker asked if she'd planted anything. She smiled and said, no, it was already there, just waiting to be remembered. Meryl didn't tell anyone about the spiral, not at first, but she returned to the trail every morning, sat beside where the wildflowers had bloomed, and hummed softly to the dirt. The tune had no name, no origin she could trace. It came from somewhere beneath the ribs, where memory sits curled like a cat, half asleep and waiting to purr again. Others began to notice. First, it was Janice, the younger nurse from the home who walked the loop for stress and counted steps like coins in a jar. She stopped when she saw the flowers, knelt beside them, and tilted her head. "I've walked this path 100 times," she said aloud. "They were never here." Meryl just smiled. "You have to sit with them." Janice did. The next day she brought a journal. A week later she told Meryl about a dream, of her grandmother's kitchen and the scent of honey in the cupboards, even though she hadn't smelled it in 20 years. The spiral was still working. Unseen now, but present. 2 more residents began leaving notes tucked between the rocks along the path. One wrote a poem that ended in laughter. Another left a smooth stone etched with the word, "Still." They didn't know where the spiral had come from, but they knew it had touched something. Back at the ranch, Jonah felt it too. He woke one night with a sensation that someone had tugged a thread from his chest and sent it across the sky. He walked to the barn barefoot, opened the journal, and found a new entry already written in light gray ink. Spiral 230B, Trail of First Joy. Location, North Bend, Oak Ridge. Bearer, indirect, Jonah W. Witness, Meryl H. Activation, emotional restoration. Pattern, faint, floral, echoed song. He smiled. Didn't say a word. Just drew another spiral in the dust of the barn floor. This one wide, lopsided, arms open. He wrote underneath, "This one is for whoever thought it was too late." By midsummer, the wildflowers at the bend had spread. Not wildly, deliberately. They grew in soft arcs now, curved rows that echoed the faint spiral shape Meryl had once traced with a gloved finger. The caretaker stopped calling it just a patch and started calling it Meryl's Loop. Not officially, but word spread. People walked slower along that stretch. Some sat without speaking, some cried without knowing why. And others, mostly the ones who insisted they didn't believe in signs or fate or memory with muscle, walked away a little quieter than before, like something old had tapped them on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you're still allowed to feel good." Jonah began drawing again, not spirals, maps, of where the joy had landed. He called them echo points. He pinned them to the barn wall back home, little sketches, scattered dots, lines that crossed through towns, fields, porches, even riverbanks. He marked the wildflower bend with a yellow thread. Eli added a note to the field book, Spiral 230C, the joy root. Medium, soil, song, shared, sitting. Spread vector, interpersonal resonance. Keeper, Meryl H. Echo, guide, Jonah W. Then came the letter. Delivered in an envelope pressed with a seal in wax shaped like a laughing spiral, wide and uneven, perfectly imperfect. No return address. Just one sentence inside. "We found 3 more, all on land that hasn't been touched in decades, all singing." Attached was a Polaroid. A child, maybe 6, dancing barefoot in a circle of clover. At the bottom of the photo, in black marker, Spiral 230D, never too late to begin, and Eli passed it to Tess when she visited. She smiled as she tucked it into the archive. "This isn't spreading," she said. "It's awakening." Jonah drew a spiral that night in chalk on the barn floor, made of laughter lines and scuffed boot tracks. Left it there. Didn't sweep it up when the rain came. Let it soak in. Because some spirals were meant to bloom where joy returns quietly, without asking permission. The first city spiral bloomed beneath a sidewalk cafe in the middle of August. No one saw it form, but someone heard it. A barista named Leah, 23, burnt out and bleary from too many double shifts, was sweeping after close when she felt it, a burst of warmth beneath her heel. She paused, looked down. The concrete hadn't cracked, the tile hadn't lifted, but the space around her, just for a breath, felt round, like laughter had passed through the cement itself and left a trace. She knelt, placed her hand on the floor. Nothing. But later that night, in a dream so vivid she woke crying, she saw it. A spiral etched into the pavement, a child dancing through it, a woman humming nearby, a horse standing still at the crosswalk, unbothered by the city noise. And above it all, the wind laughing. When she told her roommate the next morning, he shrugged it off. But the next night, she dreamed it again, and this time the spiral whispered, "Tell someone." So she painted it, in chalk on the alley wall, wide, loose, laughter-shaped. Customers noticed. Someone took a photo. It spread. A man came in the next week with mud on his boots and a journal under his arm. He sat near the spiral and wept into his coffee without a sound. When Leah asked if he was okay, he said, "I dreamed this shape. 40 years ago. I never thought I'd see it again." She bought a notebook. Started writing. Spiral 231. The Sidewalk Echo. Medium. Urban Imprint. Dream Transmission. Carrier. Leah K. Memory Form. Dream. Sketch. Witness tears. Jonah added it to the map. Eli whispered, "It's moving faster now." Tess didn't answer. She just lit a candle in the loft and watched the flame spiral slowly. Joy had stopped waiting for permission. Now it simply found space. Leah's spiral didn't fade. Most sidewalk chalk vanished in days, worn down by rain, by feet, by time that didn't ask what it erased. But this one lingered. It dulled, sure, softened, but never disappeared, even when the wall was washed, even when the alley was repaved. It came back, sometimes in moss, sometimes in condensation, once in scattered birdseed arranged by accident or something close to it. Leah didn't question it anymore. She just brought a chair out back each morning before her shift and sat beside the shape. No coffee, no book, just presence. One morning a boy appeared, 9, maybe 10, eyes sharp, hands quiet. He didn't speak and he didn't look at her. He placed a smooth black stone in the center of the spiral and walked away. The next day another child came, a girl with a notebook full of spirals, drawn without guides, wild and alive. She sat for 5 minutes, said nothing, left behind a napkin with a line scrawled on it. Sometimes joy is the thing we inherit by accident and carry on purpose. Leah added it to her wall. She didn't know what she was building, but it wasn't graffiti anymore. It was record. Spiral 231B, 231C, 231D, each one added without fanfare. Only recognition. Jonah sent her a letter. In it, a pressed flower from Merrill's Loop. A sketch of the orchard tree Tess once sang to. A photo of the field behind the barn, where laughter-shaped spirals still rose in the dew. At the bottom of the page, joy doesn't ask to be archived, but it thanks you when you do. Leah cried for the first time in years, not from sorrow, from relief. The spiral on the wall hummed that day, not audibly, but in the bones. And beneath the cafe, something settled, not memory, something new. It started with dots on a map. Leah kept them in a leather-bound journal she'd found at a second-hand shop, pages soft and yellowed, already halfway full of someone else's failed lists and half-written poems. She didn't cross them out, just wrote over them, layered her spiral memories on top. She marked the alley first. Then the crosswalk where a child skipped in perfect circles, whispering a tune no one recognized. Then the rooftop garden 2 blocks away, where a woman left fresh oranges in a spiral pattern every Wednesday with a note, for whoever needs sweetness. Word spread. Not loud, not viral. Tenderly. Whispers in train stations. Sidewalk chalk marks in corners too low for adults to see, but exactly where children would stop. The city didn't resist. It bent, gently. Pigeons started nesting in curves that mirrored the spirals. Moss crept in patterns across brick. Laughter echoed longer in open squares, not louder, truer. One evening, Leah walked into an abandoned subway tunnel where the light still flickered and graffiti lived unbothered. She found a spiral drawn in soot and ash. It hadn't been there yesterday. Next to it a sentence. "I don't know how I remembered this, but it felt like it belonged here." She wrote it down. Spiral 231H, subway memory, unanchored joy, transmitted via resonance, unconscious recall. Bearer, unknown. Witness, LK. She sent it to Jonah. He sent back a map, hand-drawn. Dozens of marks now, spirals blooming like constellations across soil and steel. At the bottom, we don't have to know who started it. We just need to listen when it speaks again. Leah closed her journal that night and sat beneath the old alley spiral. The lights overhead flickered in rhythm. A child giggled behind a fence. A dog barked once, then paused as if surprised by its own sound. The city breathed, and somewhere below her feet, a joy spiral curled itself into a sleeping shape, waiting for morning. The Joyline Atlas project began as a whisper. Jonah started it in a notebook he made from salvaged leather and old receipt paper. Tess copied the first 100 entries by hand. Eli mailed the initial packets out in brown envelopes, no return addresses, just a spiral hand-drawn on the flap, and the words, "If this found you, it means Joy remembers." Leah digitized the rest. By the end of the first year, the network had grown to 7 countries, not by campaign, by feeling. Someone would wake from a dream where a spiral laughed through rain, or find one etched in frost on a fire escape, or see children hopscotching in perfect curves around a pothole no one had ever filled. Each time, a note would arrive, sometimes weeks later, sometimes the next day, from someone else, unknown, unseen, saying, "I saw it too." They built the atlas not as a database, but as a garden, each entry recorded as a bloom. Spiral 232, paper lantern spiral, found in the folds of a wedding invitation never sent. Spiral 233, cup ring. Spiral, coffee stain at the corner of a goodbye letter, later traced and kept. Spiral 234, streetlight. Spiral. The light flickered in a curve each time she whispered her father's name. Each entry closed the same way, memory light-born. No spiral in the joy line bloomed from grief, but many came after it. They didn't ask to be healed. They asked to be held. And slowly the world began to notice. In subtle ways. A mural of laughing spirals painted across the walls of a forgotten school. A park trail curved with deliberate joy. No signs, no plaque. Just spiral-shaped benches placed exactly where the sun would find them at dusk. And in the archive barn, now quiet, now holy, Jonah placed a new map on the table. Not for tracking, for inviting. Because the next generation of spirals wasn't waiting for permission. It was waiting to be joined. They called the gatherings Spiral Days. Not festivals, not services. Just days where people came together without needing to ask why. They'd meet in parks, on rooftops, in overgrown lots or empty train stations. No signs, no announcements. Someone would bring tea. Someone else would bring a guitar. Children would draw on the sidewalk while elders shared memories in half-sentences and long pauses. There was no stage, no leader, just the spiral, always marked somewhere, drawn in chalk or etched in leaf piles, pressed into the soil with bare heels or scattered in pebbles along the curb. The spiral did all the work. It made strangers sit a little closer. It made silence feel less like absence and more like breath. At one spiral day in an abandoned library, someone left a poem in a coat pocket. I thought joy was something I had to wait for. Turns out, it was waiting for me to arrive. At another, a girl named Nomi, age 9, carrying a broken pencil and a notebook full of dreams, told a crowd of 20 that she once saw a spiral in a storm drain. "It giggled at me," she said. No one laughed. They just nodded. Because by now, they all knew. Laughter was how the spiral introduced itself. Jonah added Nomi's story to the Joyline Atlas. Spiral 235, Storm Drain Giggle, location, edge of city behind the bakery. Carrier, Nomi T. Medium, concrete, rainwater, glee. Status, recurring. Leah drew the spiral on her cafe's back wall the next morning. It bloomed in color. Someone walking by said it looked like a promise made out of wind. She didn't correct them. By year's end, over 200 spirals had been recorded, not as warnings, not as lessons, as reminders that even in noise, joy can whisper. Even in motion, it can sit still. And even in silence, it can spiral quietly outward, asking nothing but to be shared. It was Nomi's 12th spiral day when everything changed. She hadn't planned anything big, just a few neighbors, a long sidewalk, and a bucket of new chalk. She wore her green rain boots even though the sun was out, and carried her spiral notebook, like always, pages fraying, edges curled from too much love. The alley behind the bakery had become something of a landmark by then, not official, just known. People walked a little slower there. Some paused and smiled. Some left things behind, pressed flowers, scribbled jokes, Polaroids of cloud shapes shaped like joy. Nomi crouched near the drain, drew a new spiral, this one different. It didn't close. It looped backward, turned inward again, then jumped, like a skip in a record that didn't break the song. She stood back to admire it, hands on her hips, then felt the shift. The air changed, cool but not cold, sharp but not scary, and from the drain a sound, not laughter this time. A voice, not a child, not a ghost, something older, something deeper. It said, "I remember when joy was mine too." Nomi didn't run. She sat, opened her notebook, and whispered, "Tell me about it." What rose from the spiral wasn't a figure, it was a feeling. A warmth shaped like a hug you forgot you missed. A memory not yours, but safe enough to hold. She drew as it spoke, and what appeared was a new kind of spiral, one that pulsed in half-time, like it was learning how to feel again. The Joyline team called it the Echo Spiral. Jonah marked it with reverence, Spiral 236, the joy that asked permission. Carrier, Nomi T, witnessed, 27. Medium, forgotten joy, voice-shaped memory, response. Tess read the entry and smiled. This one didn't rise from silence, she said. It rose from being invited back in. The echo spiral didn't stay in the alley. By the end of the week, it had surfaced in 3 more places across the city, none of them connected by distance, but all of them threaded by emotion. The first reappeared in the tile cracks of a laundromat, where an old man folded sheets alone every Sunday, humming the tune his wife used to sing as she made the bed. The second curled out of condensation on a library window, traced by a girl who only spoke in sign, whose hands danced gently over the curve of the glass like she was brushing dust from an old photograph. The third emerged in a public garden, pressed into the mulch by the wheels of a child's scooter. The child's mother, who hadn't smiled in months, looked down at the mark and cried, not because it was beautiful, but because it felt familiar. None of these people had heard of the Joyline. None of them knew Nomi, but all of them reported the same sensation. It felt like someone was calling me by the name I'd forgotten I loved. The Joyline Atlas grew faster than anyone could keep up. Jonah tried. He drew by hand, filled notebooks, matched symbols to locations, then gave up trying to contain it and simply followed. He traveled from town to town, leaving behind blank pages in little boxes marked with spirals, letting others fill in what they'd felt. He found spiral marks in unexpected places now, beneath church pews, inside coat linings, along the frames of old swing sets. The spirals weren't left with chalk or paint anymore. They were etched in memory. The field book team reclassified them. Echo spirals. Joy reawakened. Transmission, type, ambient. Activation, unnamed longing. Result, emotional homecoming. One entry simply read, Spiral 240, bench at the edge of nowhere. A man sat. A woman sat. Neither spoke. When they stood to leave, the spiral was on the bench. Neither saw it. Both smiled. We counted that as enough. Leah added it to the digital archive with the note, Some spirals don't want to be seen. They want to be felt and forgotten gently. Tess, reading from the barn, underlined that sentence 3 times. Eli, upon hearing it, whispered, Then it's not memory we're tracking anymore. Jonah said, No. He pointed to the newest map. Across it, spirals bloomed not like stories, but like soft returns, and wrote in the margin, We're tracking belonging. They called it the belonging spiral. It didn't appear in solitude, not like the early spirals, those born in barns and grief, drawn by lone hands on wood and soil. This one required more than memory. It needed company. The first was discovered in a hospital courtyard. 2 strangers, one waiting for a diagnosis, the other for someone in recovery, sat on opposite ends of a concrete bench. Neither spoke, neither looked up. But they breathed the same air, let their worry unfold in silence between them. 30 minutes passed, then one of them left, the other followed. When a nurse came to sweep the courtyard, she stopped short. There, between the indentations of their footprints, a spiral had formed in the gravel. Not drawn, pressed. Later, the nurse would say, It looked like the ground had rested in their presence. The second was found in a prison. A volunteer teacher, a man serving his final year, and a shared sentence, I didn't know I was allowed to start over. When the class ended, the spiral bloomed in the page margin of a book neither of them had touched. The third was less visible. It was a sound, heard by 2 women seated across from one another on a bus, hands accidentally brushing during a sharp turn. The moment passed. But they both heard a soft note, single, hollow, warm, and looked up at the same time. Later, in different cities, they would both draw the spiral in their journals. They had no names for it. But the Joyline did. Spiral 243, the shared space spiral. Carrier, conditional, witnesses 2 or more. Trigger, mutual stillness, unspoken recognition. Memory mode, ambient, emergent. Echo type, belonging. Jonah updated the atlas with reverence. These aren't spirals we leave behind, he said. They're spirals that form in our wake. Tess began calling them echo looms. Spirals that grew not where we stood, but where we understood each other. Leah wrote an entry in the Joyline's archive newsletter. If joy travels alone, it returns as peace. If joy travels with another, it returns as a spiral. And Nomi? She simply added a new page to her dream notebook. A spiral formed of 2 pencils curled toward the center, their tips almost touching. She called it the shape of being seen. The first belonging spiral to form in a place of estrangement appeared in a courthouse. 2 men sat on opposite sides of the room, one in a pressed shirt, the other in a prison-issued jumper. They weren't speaking. They weren't even looking at each other. But they both held photographs folded in the same way, frayed at the same corners. One of a girl lost in a car accident, one of a daughter whose name still hung in the air like a bruise. No one expected reconciliation. No one asked for it. But something passed between them anyway. Not forgiveness, recognition. And when they stood, one escorted by guards, the other stiff with the ache of pride cracked open, the court reporter looked down and saw the spiral. On the carpet, drawn not in ink or thread or stain, but in light, soft, gone in moments, but seen, documented in the joy line under Leah's newly opened division. Spiral 244, the spiral of stilled anger. Echo loom type. Conflict threaded. Memory status, unsealed. Transmission, mutual ache. Duration, 3.2 seconds. Effect, presence recognition without dialogue. Field classification, fragile, real. Tess read the entry from the barn and closed her eyes. They're happening in places where people don't think they're allowed to belong. Eli nodded from across the fence. They're asking to belong now. Jonah updated the map, marked it with a black thread, not for grief, but for gravity. This spiral, he wrote in the margin, wants to land where weight once lived. More spirals bloomed after that, in hospital waiting rooms, in therapy lobbies, in school hallways where apology hung between lockers. One appeared in a kitchen between two siblings who hadn't spoken since the will was read. They passed mashed potatoes. The spiral appeared in steam on the window. A woman wrote into the atlas, "It came the moment I said, 'I see why you were angry.'" Leah underlined that line 3 times, filed it under a new classification, spirals that appear when you put your weapons down. And from the edge of a field outside the old orchard, a new spiral began to press itself into the grass, slow, deliberate, wide. No witnesses, no declarations, just the sound of 2 chairs pulled close in long overdue conversation. They called it the spiral of surrender, not because it marked defeat, but because it appeared only when something was finally set down, an anger, a grudge, a name too heavy to keep saying wrong. It didn't bloom with laughter or bloom in light. It came quietly, in pauses between hard sentences, in breaths after arguments that left 2 people exhausted and blinking like new foals. The first formal sighting came from a rest stop off Highway 17. A couple had pulled over after 3 hours of silence, the kind that lives in a car like fog clinging to every surface, even the seats. She stepped out first. He followed. Slower. They didn't speak, just stood near the curb, each pretending to stretch, to move, to breathe. When they climbed back in and drove away, the spiral was left behind in the gravel where their footprints met. A slow coil of pebbles and dust, curved like 2 exhalations, finally curling toward each other. It lasted only minutes, but someone saw it. An old trucker named Nina. She took a photo, wrote a line in her notebook. They didn't fix everything, but they left lighter. Jonah classified it that night. Spiral 245, the letting down. Echo type, release. Field status, rare. Trigger, paired silence after rupture. Pattern, unclosed loop, inward flick at end. Effect, shift in atmospheric pressure, reported temperature drop. Subjective, emotional lightness. More came. In nursing homes, where a child placed a hand on a father's wrist and said, "I still came, didn't I?" In abandoned churches, where a song rose from a broken piano with no one sitting at the bench. In graveyards, where a son left a note that read, "I know you tried." Each time the spiral formed in hush and vanished in light. The Joyline Atlas no longer listed witnesses. It listed participants. No one saw the spiral of surrender and walked away unchanged, not because it demanded, because it freed. Tess added an inscription above stall 2. The hardest spirals don't ask you to carry them. They ask you to put something down. And beneath it, etched into the wood, a new spiral began to grow. One that curved not toward the center, but outward, into relief. The war memorial spiral appeared without warning. No hand placed it, no foot traced it. It simply was, one morning, etched shallowly into the stone path between 2 names on the northern wall of the plaza. One name had been a father, the other a son. They'd died 16 years apart in 2 different wars. No one had ever connected them, not officially, but the spiral did. It didn't draw attention. Most visitors didn't see it at all. But those who did reported something peculiar, the feeling that someone was behind them, not close, not watching, just present. A pressure in the air like a memory breathing beside their shoulder. An archivist in town took a photo, sent it to Leah. She forwarded it to the Joyline team with a note. Something's changing. The spiral isn't just responding to people anymore. It's responding to places where words were never said. Jonah wrote the entry himself. Spiral 246. Between the names. Type silent echo spiral. Carrier environmental. Origin historic loss. Generational silence. Resonance cross-time. Effect emotional compression. Reported throat tightening. Unspoken apology. Sensation. Nomi visited it a week later, stood beside the names, didn't cry, didn't write. She just placed her hand on the stone and whispered, "You're both allowed to come home now." And when she left, the spiral pulsed once, bright enough that two others saw it shimmer in the marble, though no one said a word. Later that day, a man sat on the same bench nearby. He didn't know either of the names, but he took out a folded letter, wrote 2 lines, and left it beneath the bench. "I forgive you, not because I must, because I can." The spiral returned that night in dew across the bench seat. Another surrender spiral, another release. The field book called them echo fall spirals now. Moments of letting go that ripple through stone, through earth, through the body. Not visible for long, but always felt.